It's wonderful to see the Buckley family. I knew Bill some. I was too much in awe of Bill to really consider him a friend or really to sort of try to become his friend, I suppose. I now regret that in a way. He was always very welcoming and friendly, but I was a little, I think, timid around him. The one Buckley I worked for was Jim Buckley. I volunteered for in the summer of 1970. I was between high school and college, and I did a few days of volunteer work for his Senate campaign as the conservative candidate against, was it Chuck Goodell, I guess, was the liberal Republican, the Rockefeller appointee, and I guess Ottinger was the Democrat, if I recall correctly. And I remember going, this somehow sticks in my mind, I was literally just handing out leaflets, sort of trailing the candidate around as he went around shaking hands. And it was Captive Nations Day, which they used to have, and luckily we don't have anymore, thanks in part to Ronald Reagan and Bill Buckley and American conservatism. And it was Captive Nations Day in Central Park, and so there were a lot of people there and different kind of booths with different nations represented. And I remember following Jim Buckley around, handing out Buckley for Senate pamphlets, and coming back and going to Harvard and telling one of my professors, I don't know how this came up, I can't believe I was foolish enough to say this, but to say that maybe he'd asked if I had done anything political, and I said not much really, though I did a little volunteer work for Jim Buckley and at Captive Nations Day in New York over the summer, late summer I think it was, and this professor said, well, it's as likely that Jim Buckley will be elected to the Senate as a conservative as that the captive nations will no longer be captive. And I've always liked the fact that he was wrong about both of those things. I will say this, incidentally, that victory in 1970 was very important Bill Buckley's race in '65 for mayor was important as a kind of educational matter and a dramatic, I think, galvanizing of conservatives in New York, but really around the country. But the victory in 1970, it's hard for people these days to put themselves in the shoes of what it was like to be an unapologetic Buckley conservative in New York. Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York. John Lindsay was the mayor of New York City. This was not, it was still the citadel of American liberalism. And for Jim to beat an incumbent Republican, a liberal Republican, and a Democrat in that race and get elected was really a harbinger, I think, of what was to happen 10 years later, and with Reagan's victory in 1980, and an important moment in a sense where the conservative movement, for almost the first time, flat out won a race against both the liberal Republican establishment and a Democrat. So I've always been pleased by my 2 days of volunteer work in that race. I don't think it made much difference, but I enjoyed it. I think the last time I exchanged emails with Bill Buckley, I was thinking about this coming up here, was when it was announced that I was going to be writing a column for a year at least, and it ended up only being a year for the New York Times in 2008, and Bill very graciously sent me an email saying, as I recall, something like, congratulations, this is great news, it's good for you and good for the New York Times. This is a rare case where Bill was wrong, or at least the New York Times didn't share his view after a year, and I'm not sure I did either, but even Bill Buckley could be wrong occasionally. But it was characteristic of him. We hadn't been in particularly close touch, and it was characteristic of him to go out of his way to sort of give me some encouragement as I began that rather difficult year of criticizing Barack Obama as he was running for president on the New York Times op-ed page. And thinking about Bill Buckley, and I really will be very brief. These have been such terrific speeches. I have very little to add, and I certainly don't want to bore you with my thoughts about the current state of the conservative movement and that inspiring Republican presidential field that Christopher discussed. In thinking about Bill Buckley, I was struck by two characteristics of his that are an apparent tension or contradiction that I do think characterize most great men, and I do think Bill really was a great man, and they are boldness and humility. And I do think great men obviously are bold, they're risk takers, they put themselves forward, they do things and propose to do things that most of us wouldn't presume to try to do, and Bill certainly had that characteristic. But also, if they're thoughtful great men, they're usually humble in a certain way. They know how contingent history is, to pick up on a phrase Henry used. They understand that how what higher percentage of human endeavors fail or don't quite work out the way one hopes they will, how problematic all these efforts are. And I do think Bill also had that humility. And I went back and I was looking at some of Bill's earlier writings, and was particularly struck, and I'll just read a tiny bit of this, by the mission statement he wrote for the first issue of National Review. It's famous really for that one sentence now that everyone quotes, which is a great sentence, I think, that National Review stands to thwart history, yelling stop, at a time when no one is inclined to do so or to have much patience with those who so urge it. And I've always thought it's become fashionable these days to sort of say, well, that was fine, but of course conservatives have to get beyond yelling stop to history. They need to shape the future, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I believe that, and I think Bill Buckley believed that, and that's what he spent a huge amount of time doing. But there was something extremely bracing, I think, and extremely important about having the nerve and the boldness to simply say stop. And again, this was a different era. This was an era in which progressive dogmas were virtually unchallenged, in which it wasn't obviously problematic to simply believe in the liberal version of humanity and the liberal version of the state and the liberal progressive version of history. And now, in a way, one can challenge all these things and one can get in some trouble in the academy, but it's not actually that hard. Both experience and many thinkers, like Bill, have made it much easier. But in that time, in 1955, to sort of say that was important. And I know as a young man reading National Review, as a kid, really not a young man, as a teenager reading National Review, how important that attitude was, I think, in attracting me to National Review and to conservatism. The sort of unembarrassed, apparently uncalculating assertion of what we think this is right, and we don't really care whether it's fashionable, and we don't care whether it's easy, and we don't care whether everyone is saying you can't say this anymore. This is what we think is the right thing to do for the country or for the world or for human beings, and we're going to stand that way. And I think that saying stop at a time when no one is inclined to do so is a very important, it was really a huge contribution and really laid the basis for the magazine's efforts and obviously everything that came out of the magazine subsequently.